good afternoon and welcome to this COMPAS webinar on authoritarian versus democratic responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Eric McGilvray. I'm a professor in the political science department here at Ohio State, and I'm the coordinator of this year's COMPAS series on COVID-19. As many of you know, COMPAS is a program of the Ohio State Center for Ethics and Human Values. COMPAS is an acronym that stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society, and the mission of the COMPAS program is to promote informed and civil discussion of important and controversial public issues. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the most important and controversial issues facing our nation and the world today, and today's panel is the fourth in our spring series of COMPAS events that explore the ethical and political dimensions of the pandemic and the response to it. Our fifth and final panel will be next Friday, March 19th, at this time and also on Zoom. The topic will be the pros and cons of federalism and the response to the COVID crisis, and it will feature Don Kettle from the University of Texas at Austin and Michelle Mello from Stanford University, with moderation by my colleague Vlad Kogan. More details about that panel and about the whole COVID COMPAS series, including videos of our previous events, are available at cehv.osu.edu/COMPAS. Today's panel, By the People or For the People, Authoritarian versus Democratic Responses to COVID, will be moderated by my colleague Rick Herman. I'll let Rick introduce our panelists, but first let me briefly introduce him. Rick is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science here at Ohio State, where he served for many years as director of the Mershon Center for International Security Studies and as chair of the Department of Political Science, simultaneously, I think, at one point. Rick specializes in American foreign policy and the politics of the Middle East and Russia, with special emphasis on the role of nationalism and identity politics in world affairs, obviously germane to today's topic. Rick, take it away.
Thank you, Eric. It's very nice to be here to moderate and to introduce two really terrific speakers who can speak directly to the topic of today. Let me introduce them. First is David Stasavage. He's Dean of Social Sciences and the Julius Silver Professor in the Department of Politics at New York University. He's also an affiliated professor in NYU's Law School. His most recent book is called The Decline and Rise of Democracy, A Global History from Antiquity to Today. It's come out in 2020. And it provides a new understanding of both early democracies in multiple world regions and explains also how the long evolution of modern democracy might provide lessons that are relevant for today. It's a deep exploration of the history of democracy. He's also, David is also an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has written previously on fiscal fairness in the United States and the development of European polities. He will speak first. Following him, Jessica Chen Weiss, who's an associate professor of government at Cornell University, will speak. She's the author of Powerful Patriots, Nationalist Protest in China's Foreign Relations that Oxford published in 2014. She's also the author of many articles on China and international relations that have appeared in all the leading journals of my discipline, International Organization, China Quarterly, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and Security Studies. And she will follow David. So without further ado, I'm going to, let me tell everyone that if you have questions, you need to ask them through the question and answer function, and then I will pass them on to the speakers after they're done. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we hope to have a lively conversation between you, the audience, and our speakers. So now, without further ado, David, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Rick. Thanks to everybody for attending today and for inviting me virtually to your center to discuss this really important topic about authoritarian and democratic responses to the COVID epidemic. I want to start off by first providing a little bit of a broad frame to things and suggesting that there's actually a very long-standing debate among political scientists, historians, and others about how well democracies versus authoritarian regimes do in dealing with emergencies. So you can think of emergencies as traditionally 3 of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: war, famine, and pestilence. And if you look through famous scholarship, you'll see people making claims about whether democracies or autocracies do better in dealing with them. In a more modern version, we might want to think of newer forms of emergencies as well, such as climate change and the risk that poses to us all. And you might also want to think in the context of the world's most prominent democracy being the United States, arguably, and perhaps the world's most prominent authoritarian regime being China, that, you know, going forward, the effectiveness of these two different countries with two very different political systems in dealing with emergencies may have important implications for the future of the international order. So the next thing I'd like to contribute is to steer away from what I think a lot of the discussion has been founded on with regard to COVID responses, and comparing, doing a sort of a horse race between authoritarian and democratic regimes and seeing who's done better. And first of all, that's been very difficult to do for a large part because there's a lot of different authoritarian and democratic regimes. And also your conclusion on that question has changed as the pandemic has gone onwards. And we're certainly not done with it yet, though hopefully soon. And so I want to take a different tack. And what I'd instead like to talk about is how the fact that as I see it, and as I've tried to write about, authoritarian and democratic regimes each have specific strengths and weaknesses when it comes to dealing with emergencies, and when it comes to dealing in particular with an emergency like COVID. And so if you start off with an authoritarian country like China, then one of the things that is particularly striking involves the control of information. If you think of the initial events in Wuhan and the fact that they failed to become as public as one might have expected, then I think that demonstrates an amazing ability of an authoritarian regime in some cases to either at the central level or at the local level to not transmit information and not have it become public. And that's not a unique thing under Chinese history. If you go back to the Great Leap Forward 60 years ago, that was helped to trigger a very, very large scale famine. There was also a lack of knowledge as well there, attributable to the ability of an authoritarian regime to restrict information. And those are the kind of things that in the US would have been probably difficult to have happen. And you can even take it further back in Chinese history. You can look to imperial examples even of 1,000 years ago, where there were examples where a famine could be, information about it could be successfully suppressed. So in a sense then, when you come to an emergency like COVID, it feels like that is a potential disadvantage for an authoritarian regime, because if it chooses to, it can suppress information. Now, the other aspect of an authoritarian regime, though, tends to be, especially if you consider a high capacity authoritarian regime like China, is there's really an amazing amount of ability to act decisively. If you think about the lockdowns that were implemented in Wuhan and in the province around Wuhan, that's the kind of thing that would be very difficult to happen to that degree and as decisively and quickly in a Western democracy. In democracies, we have much more decentralized power sharing and decision making, and we also have possibilities of court challenges. And so what that means then, in the sense of ability to deal with a pandemic or deal with shutting it down, is that an authoritarian regime with high capacity can really act much more swiftly than a democratic country can do. Okay, so now let's consider the flip side, the other type of political regime, a democracy. And I'm going to talk about the US example of democracy in particular. Well, as I already alluded to, it's hard to imagine something like COVID, if it had broken out in the US first, being kept secret. People could certainly watch the news sources they want, and if they wanted to ignore it, then they could do so, either thinking it's a hoax or thinking it wasn't going to be a big deal or what have you. But we don't have a system in place in the United States that would allow really for stamping out information so that people would not be able to even know that this existed. And so that seems like a strength of a democracy to the extent that it's hard to ignore problems like this. It's ignore in the sense of, at least it's hard to say that they don't exist, even though, of course, over the last year and a half, some people certainly tried. But the downside in democratic countries, and I think in particular in a very decentralized polity like the United States, where we have our country emerged as a result of dispersed patterns of settlement, decentralization. I guess there's links to your discussion about federalism next week, makes it difficult to have a centralized response. If you think of what it was like in the early weeks of the pandemic, where I am currently in New York City, one where was very, very sensed the sort of lack of central coordination or support in this to deal with this pandemic. And one might feel that that was perhaps a deliberate choice of the administration that was in power at the time. But what I think I'd add to that is that irrespective of which administration would have been in power, Democrat or Republican, there is a certain amount of decentralization in the US system that just makes it harder to act quickly and decisively against a pandemic and distinguishes it from a high capacity authoritarian regime like the Chinese one. So what's a democracy to do then? In the few minutes that remain to me, I just want to talk about three alternatives to think about what democracies could do and what we learn of this about dealing with COVID or dealing with future emergencies, be they future emergencies involving pandemics or what have you. One possibility that's been raised, and this goes way very far back in time, is to suggest that there ought to be some sort of emergency powers in a democracy. Some people have called this constitutional dictatorship. Some people revert to the original Roman dictatorship, which is actually a very, very limited form of dictatorships. Modern experience with emergency powers has not been a particularly positive one. I mean, one of the prime examples is the possibility to rule by decree in the Weimar Constitution, which helped the Nazi Party ultimately to take power and to come to power. And there's other examples as well. And there have been examples today in countries from Hungary to Cambodia, where would-be authoritarian rulers have used the ability to resort to emergency powers as a way ostensibly of dealing with the COVID pandemic, but in fact of also increasing their rule. The example of Hun Sen in Cambodia, a long-serving prime minister, was that he used the pretext of the pandemic to basically shut down, or not shut down, but to assert control over all media in the country. So the emergency powers solution is not that great. The second solution, which I think is in effect what was tried in the US in the early stages of the pandemic, was to leave it to the localities. The Trump administration, in many senses, apart from the vaccine development, had a policy of saying, leave it to states to deal with this. They're the ones. There was not a massive coordinated federal response. And the problem with this is ultimately, I think the experience showed that when you had nurses in hospitals having to wear garbage bags because they didn't have proper PPE, then ultimately maybe you do need an effective coordinated central response rather than having people just fend for themselves. So that's a second option that I don't think works that well either. So the third option for democracies to deal with emergencies, and this is really when we think about the next pandemic or the next emergency of this sort, is to build central state capacity that can be used effectively and to build it beforehand. And the two really fascinating examples here come from Taiwan and South Korea. There are others, but I'd like to focus on those two, where they actually had a very robust system in place before COVID to deal with this sort of eventuality, allowing for a temporary degree of surveillance where you would do things like link customs data with credit card transactions. So you could really do trace people and do contact tracing and see who was involved and where they were to prevent the virus from propagating. And the interesting thing about each of those two countries is that they had a prior experience with a virus in the 21st century that wasn't nearly as bad as the experience we've had with COVID, but that nonetheless scared them into action. So that was the case with the SARS virus in Taiwan. It was the case more recently with the MERS virus in Korea. And so some people have suggested that that experience of a would-be pandemic would perhaps launch them into action, and was what allowed for that creation of state capacity. Now, the problem, though, I think in a lot of democracies, and perhaps this applies to the US, is that democracies are often better at providing cures than prevention. The empirical work that's been done by political scientists suggests, for example, that politicians get rewarded for flood relief after a flood has happened, but they don't really get rewarded at the ballot box for flood control that's been implemented prior to a flood even happening to keep it from happening. And so it's almost as if, for some democracies, if we take Ben Franklin's original maxim that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, at the ballot box, the worry is potentially that a pound of cure is worth, an ounce of cure is worth a pound of prevention. And I'll stop there.
Jessica, we'll turn to you now.
Great, thanks so much for those fascinating comments, David. I also agree that regime type comparisons aren't as useful as thinking about the similarities as well as the differences, both within as well as across regime types. So for all that many democracies like the United States performed poorly, at least to date, compared to others, many other democracies like Taiwan and South Korea performed very well. And while China performed well after its initial delays in containing the outbreak in Wuhan, it's still hard to know, I think, how well other developing autocracies performed, especially due to differences in demographics as well as less testing overall. And so this regime type distinction, I think, particularly the structural advantages or disadvantages, may actually be less important than the choices that leaders made within each system, whether they prioritized public health and collective responsibility or growth and individual liberty. And so compared to David's emphasis on these differences in capacity and information control, I'd also like to emphasize the importance of framing as well as fiction, where leaderships in both types of governments have chosen to indulge in publicly promoting alternative facts or conspiracy theories about COVID. But I think there's been significant differences in whether these sort of alternative facts appeared to guide policy as opposed to just propaganda. So that's sort of where I want to go. Let me start with, building out from a new theoretical framework that I recently published with Jeremy Wallace, an international organization titled Domestic Politics, China's Rise and the Future of the Liberal International Order, where we build a new framework to explain how domestic politics and China's foreign policy affects its approach to global governance, including problems like COVID, problems without passports. To make a long story short, the basic idea is that how an issue plays out depends on how central it is to the government leadership's sort of pillars, self-established pillars of legitimacy, as well as how domestically divisive that issue is. So here's how that worked in the context of COVID. I don't think you can understand China's response, the whole of it, without attention to these domestic center-local divisions. Had the central government known of the pandemic, the extent of a human-to-human transmission in those very early days, I don't think it would have chosen to suppress this information or ignore the crisis. So as Dali Yang wrote in a piece for the Monkey Cage that I worked on, China's governance system has prioritized growth while maintaining stability, but central local tensions and bureaucratic shortfalls complicate this picture. Because the threat of instability like this outbreak tends to see local authorities trying to control information and restoring order. And so this produces feigned compliance, distortion, and subterfuge, which is a key part of the story about how COVID-19 escaped Wuhan, despite efforts after SARS to build kind of early warning systems. Local officials were not interested in having any kind of mass panic or local instability on the eve of important political meetings in the province. Another thing that COVID-19, I think, also revealed was the trade-offs in the different emphases in Chinese priorities at the national level, prioritizing stability, including public health and safety first, before the kind of growth that we had all seen as sustaining, China's performance legitimacy in the wake of kind of the global bankruptcy of communism. And so what we saw in China's the Chinese government's initial reaction to COVID was an effort actually to crack down on individuals who were spreading conspiracy theories about the US origins of the pandemic. And it wasn't until the outbreak was under control inside China that the CCP went on a public relations offensive to boast of China's superior response, the inadequacy of other governments, as well as fanning in state television conspiracy theories about the US military potentially bringing the virus to China. And so while Chinese propaganda may continue to boast of its relative success, I think it's hard to see much that the government would be able to export in the way of a coherent model. And I think that success at fighting COVID doesn't require having a Chinese-style autocracy to implement. So other democratic governments, I think, also implemented relatively stringent quarantine, testing, and electronic tracing schemes if you look to South Korea and Taiwan. But I think it's really important also to note some of the similarities and common pathologies across regime types that emerged during the pandemic, including this tendency to scapegoat outsiders and already marginalized minorities. And so it's, I think, really important to pay attention to the framing of a particular issue like COVID, recognizing that it's quite malleable and subject to a lot of elite, what we in political science talk about as elite cues, as well as popular interpretations. So the Chinese government's, the central leadership, again, prioritized public health and declared a people's war on COVID, only later moving to restart the economy. Whereas the Trump administration here in the United States, again, I don't want to overemphasize the focus on the United States, but often these comparisons are, well, certainly drawn by China, but also I think in the popular consciousness too. So the Trump administration instead prioritized individual liberty, and as David mentioned, it sort of attacked, or certainly delegated this response. Not just delegated though, but also attacked local officials and experts who called for more stringent public health restrictions. And so interestingly, both of these strategies played to nationalism, but different kinds, where the CCP emphasized collective responsibility and by and large, the Republican Party under Trump, by and large emphasized, individual liberty against mask mandates and the like. And so I want to note that these were not, I think, inevitable responses that one can predict from institutional differences between democracy and autocracy, but rather flowed from the particular, you might call them ideologies or partisan priorities and beliefs that particular leaders chose to embrace or overcome. And so what then are the implications for this conversation? I think the variation within autocracies and democracies may be more consequential than the differences between these two ideal types. And so to use the language of the IO framework, heterogeneity or contestation looks different. Of course, like the baseline looks different across autocratic and democratic states. I think, but it's important to recognize that these domestic constraints, whether in an autocratic or democratic setting, can be adapted or overturned. So we're in the world of what Susan Hyde and Elizabeth Saunders called a world of malleable constraints, even if the baseline looks a bit different across regime types in general. And some may be tempted, I think, and have been tempted to conflate China's relative success as elevating the global appeal of autocracy over democracy. And there is indeed a material discrepancy between the two countries' responses, at least to date. But while China has boasted of the superiority of its response, I think these efforts have been primarily meant to shore up the CCP's credibility before domestic as well as international audiences, to push back against demands that China pay reparations for the virus, et cetera. And so far, I don't see much evidence of the CCP trying to explicitly encourage or require others to copy, Chinese-style methods around the world, sort of as the price of assistance with the vaccine or the, distribution of PPE. So ultimately, I come down to the comparison, really says less about autocracy versus democracy than the choices that individual leaders, whether in China, the United States, or elsewhere, chose when faced with the facts. So both chose to some extent to shift blame and attack the other, promoting these kind of tit-for-tat conspiracy theories. But ultimately, in this comparison, Chinese leaders dealt with the material reality by prioritizing the short-term measures necessary to halt the spread of the virus at the cost to economic growth and individual liberty. The Trump administration strategy, as it first arrived on US shores, was to avoid taking collective responsibility for the crisis, blaming China, but leaving it to local officials, except where those officials challenged the Trump administration's narrative. So we'll have to see now, I think, with the Biden administration taking a very different tack, whether or not these preliminary judgments further dissipate as we see what a democracy can do once mobilized at the federal level to prioritize public health rather than seeing economic growth and just muddling through as the way forward. Oh, Rick, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'd invite all those who are watching to ask questions via the Q&A function, and I will pass them on. I'm going to start with one that's occurred to me as I listened to two very interesting talks. I wonder if the degree of contestation among the elite already in a country, never mind if it's authoritarian or democratic, will affect how this went, because it seemed to me that, as Jessica mentioned, there's a good bit of what I'll call within group variation. Democracies responded differently, Israel differently than the United States, Australia, New Zealand very differently than the United States, for example. And I imagine autocracies responded differently also. But they also differ in terms of the degree of, I don't know, the intensity of political contestation. And here in the United States, it was intense before COVID and through COVID. So COVID became one more cudgel that you could use to beat the political opponents with, and both sides did that. And I don't know whether that was possible within the Chinese context, but where do you think authoritarian versus democratic systems, one or the other, has some kind of advantage here in terms of either managing political contestation or in stomping it out when it becomes a tool like this for political debate or political maneuvering?
I'll take that at first. I think it's a really interesting question. I don't think that it's hard to say advantage or disadvantage, but they certainly did play out differently. And I think that despite the fact that, of course, the CCP is an authoritarian, single party regime, is much better at stamping out contestation, whereas it persisted and probably affected the outcome of the 2020 US presidential election, nonetheless faced, I think, a fair bit of sharpened insecurity as a result of the contestation that emerged, particularly around the death of the local doctor Li Wenliang, and that extreme frustration at popular and elite levels with the CCP's response that led to the outbreak, the silencing or quieting of local information that would have been necessary to stop the spread early on. And so, you saw in the wake of the outbreak, calls on social media for Xi Jinping to step down, et cetera. Now, of course, subsequently, the CCP has gone out and made sure that those voices were repressed. And so, we saw high profile, arrests or detentions. Nonetheless, because the CCP, and I mean, I don't know whether, David, you would agree that, in some ways, the consequences to the CCP of this contestation were greater, right? If you think about sort of the post-ouster fate of different types of leaders, this pressure might have been far more worrying to Xi Jinping than what the Trump administration faced, although, they too are, now have lost the presidency. So in some ways, like the contestation was more open, but perhaps less decisive in the US case, or at least the incumbent leadership felt less pressure to act as a result of that. And perhaps it is that lack of a consensus around the importance of taking these, relatively strict public health measures that impeded the democratic response in the US, at least.
Yeah, let me just follow up on that. I think it's a great question and great comments from Jessica. And I just say, I do think, to my mind, there is a possibility for this sort of public contestation to take on more of an air like it took in the US in democracies as opposed to autocracies. But I think it's also useful to point out that in the US case, the degree of polarization is really extreme to what we see in most democracies. And in Western European democracies, despite the issues they have, it's hard to point to one where the COVID response has become a really polarizing force that's become a political football that's batted, I'm mixing my metaphors there, but where one party takes one issue and one view and the other party takes a completely different view. And for the US, I do think that in spite of the degree of polarization we have, ultimately this did come down to, as Jessica has been emphasizing, a choice. I don't think it's a given that the Trump administration necessarily needed to take the approach to the pandemic that it did. It's possible to envision that it would have taken a more responsive approach, and that it could have been suggested that there should be national mask wearing, and that would have been followed. I'm speculating there, I don't know. And then it might have also meant that the election outcome in November 2020 would potentially have been different. So ultimately, it does, I think the democracies have this aspect that the contestation can impede responses, but it does come back to the choices of individual administrations as well.
I have a question from Caroline Wagger, who's my colleague in our John Glenn School of Public Policy, and she studies science policy at the United States and around the world. And her question is, the play towards nationalism in China and the United States also harmed the efforts emerging from scientists to work closely together, moves which actually squashed fruitful collaboration. How do you interpret actions in both countries to efforts to control scientific messaging?
Nice to see you, Caroline. Thanks for being here. I think that the politicization of science is ultimately very harmful. And unfortunately, once the two countries got into this sort of tit for tat, spiral, it made it very difficult and it continues to be very difficult even under a very different administration, to advocate for open science when the potential security risks involved are likely to be brought up by critics of the other country. And so, I'll actually be interested in your thoughts as well on, what exactly the costs have been. Because of course there has been continuing, as you well know, continuing scientific collaboration, but just how much has been lost, I think is harder for us to judge because, again, it exists on the margins and isn't often in the public eye.
Yeah, and just to further on that, one of the remarkable things about this effort is that how the vaccine effort was really such a nationally driven one across the world, as opposed to a more collaborative one like we've seen in previous examples going back decades of mass vaccine, developing a new vaccine to deal with a deadly disease that's prevalent across the earth. And so I think that points to the obstacles that were put up to scientific exchange. Although luckily, at least the genome was sequenced early and that information was allowed to circulate.
I'm wondering whether, David, you mentioned, or I think it was you that mentioned it, maybe it was Jessica, that in Taiwan and South Korea,
oh yeah,
they were able to engage in what I would call fairly intensive surveillance by tracking people's credit card expenses and things like that. Do you think that would be possible for us to write law in the United States that would allow that kind of temporary surveillance and not be blocked by the ACLU or other people worried about where this would all lead?
Yeah, and I tend to think not. I'd like to think that we could get to that point where there would be that sort of thing where, but it does require a high degree of trust in government to say that you're going to let the federal government do that. And with trust in the federal government in Washington at something below 20%, and it's been that way for the past 15 years, that just doesn't seem an option. And the really big irony to all that, of course, is that private companies have this information in the US and know everything about us and can track us. We haven't been asked whether we would allow them to do that or not, but we're not allowing the government to do it for hopefully a more positive outcome.
Coming back to nationalism in a minute, part of this required socially mobilizing the population to pull together in some kind of common cause. And I wonder whether that is already pre-existing, the capacity for that in countries, or is it just generated on the spot? And I have the impression that some countries just have more resident, what Putnam might call social capital than others. And I'm wondering whether the regime type really captures that, because I could imagine an authoritarian regime that has cultivated over time a strong sense of in-group national cohesion. But I can also imagine that in a democracy. And so I'm wondering how you think the intersection is between what I guess I call the capacity for social mobilization, and largely through appeals, as President Biden made last night, rather than through coercion. I think by at least outside stereotyping, there's a belief I sometimes hear that countries like South Korea, for example, have an advantage there over, say, other democracies and maybe even over some authoritarian states because there's a strong sense of social duty, just to begin with. Maybe Jessica, you could respond with that first.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I mean, I think that there's we have to be really careful here about talking about, the propensity for mobilization here, because of course we've seen a lot of mobilization in the United States. It's just around opposing mask mandates or, around white supremacy. And so it's like, well, it's not an absence of an identity or around which individuals want to mobilize on, it's just a very divided set of identities. And so, and it is a more individualist notion. And so, there, I think I'm pretty reluctant to, ascribe, the differences in response to some kind of, pre-existing kind of cultural tradition, certainly not across the world, but rather, again, attending to the, the ideas and the extent to which those cultures prioritize or group strands within societies prioritize this kind of public health, doing what's necessary.
Yeah, I guess I want to respond to this, and maybe Jessica could follow up after I say this. But I'm wondering, when Jessica and I were talking last week about this, just saying, like, it seems like for some reason or another, this idea of a people's war, it can still be invoked in China in a way that it can't really in the US, whereas, we had 2 world wars. They were invoked at times as moments of national solidarity. And I don't think it's a US versus China thing, because of course, if you look at the COVID response in the UK, which was sometimes fumbling, nonetheless, you have the Queen of England going on TV and alluding to wartime sacrifice, something that happened back in the 1940s, is something that should resonate with people even today, whereas it's hard to imagine an American president, either Democrat or Republican, hearkening back to wartime sacrifice from the 1940s as a motivation for people in the same way as you could see in some of these other countries.
And yet, I mean, it's interesting that I wonder why you think that, because, both Trump and Biden have now referred to these as, warlike effort is needed.
Yeah.
And yet that maybe hasn't achieved the kind of popular resonance that maybe exists in these other examples.
I think people still try at times to refer to warlike, but it doesn't seem like it's as much of a strong a message that I imagine it must be if you refer to people's war in China, or in the UK if you refer to wartime sacrifice during World War II, which to this very day remains such a very important part of the national narrative in that particular country.
Mm.
David, you mentioned that one response that democracies had that you didn't think was always the best is the declaring emergency powers. And while we didn't do that at the federal level, we certainly did at the state level. And the governor here in Ohio, for instance, has heard a lot of complaining about that. And nearby in Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer has faced even stronger pushback against the emergency powers. So one, I'm wondering what you think about governors declaring emergency power. And Dennis Gong asks in particular what you think about the role that Governor Cuomo did in addressing the pandemic in New York. And he says, since both of you live in New York, he's wondering what your evaluation of Governor Cuomo's policies here were, performance here.
Well, I guess, the first thing I'd say is that one of the features of the emergency powers from governors in the US is they're really quite a weak version of emergency power, and yet still in some cases they're certainly not the emergency powers that you would think of that could lead to an authoritarian turn of the sort that you've seen in some other countries, where people have used much broader emergency powers to really clamp down on political opposition. With respect to Governor Cuomo, I think this one has really gone back and forth, and it depends which way you see it. It's very much slow to respond initially, and I think, of course, being in New York City, it's the governor and the mayor have a very prominent role to play. Very slow to respond initially, but then once the response was needed, more effective. And I think some of that also comes back to the relative role played by the state and federal governments again, because if more had been done to monitor and test, if we had had the ability to test people coming in from Europe, which is where the COVID-19 cases came from that really seeded the pandemic in New York, this thing could have been alleviated. And it's, in theory, that should be a federal obligation and not really a gubernatorial obligation.
Jessica, do you want to say anything, or?
I'll pass.
Okay. I have another question. Let me just read it and then you can respond. Wasn't the US response uneven and disparate due to federalism, combined with a president who did not listen to his expert advisors and proceeded to unmake the presidency, as Hennessy and Witts demonstrated? And again, then they go on to argue basically that it's, as we see now with Texas and Mississippi lifting the mask mandate, that the power in America or in the United States rests on states.
But I'd agree with the questioner, basically. I think that is a weakness. There's a lot of strengths that come from federalism in terms of individual states to be able to have a degree of self-government and implement different policies if people in different states want different things. But there are times, again, where we need a coordinated response, and the sort of relative weakness of the federal government with respect to the governors in this case really has not helped things.
There's another question. It's again within group variation. They're saying when comparing the United States to other democracies like Denmark and Norway, the participant noticed that they had significantly lower death rates per million than represented in the data from the United States. And wondering, does that reflect a lack of response from larger democracies, or does it reflect a diversity of responses from within different democracies? I guess it's asking, how can we explain the within variation across democracies?
Jessica, do you want?
This is far beyond my area of expertise. I know that some have suggested that the social welfare system has had something to do with it. I don't know if it's tied to, workers who can, more readily afford to take the time necessary to quarantine or whatnot. Whereas we know that in some places in the United States, at least, where, many that haven't had the option financially to isolate, et cetera, and also live in, overcrowded housing, et cetera, that's been very difficult to control despite, appropriate regulations, even at the local and state levels.
Yeah, and I would think that there's sort of two responses I'd have here. The first is, as social scientists, we tend to want to think, and we've gotten into a mode now of thinking that the outcomes in different countries should be explicable by things we usually look at, like different types of policies or political regimes or what have you. And what I suspect is that a virologist or an epidemiologist would emphasize that there's probably a fair degree of luck in the extent to which some countries have been hit really hard and some have not been hit as hard. So that's the sort of first thing to say, is that any of these two country comparisons, we sometimes might not want to read too much into them. But, following on what Jessica said, which I would agree with, it's also possible that in smaller polities with fewer levels of governance and a lower degree of decentralization, that it was easier to manage the pandemic than it is in such a vast democracy like the United States. So there may be something really linked to size.
Caroline Wagner is following up, noting that there's a anti-scientific, anti-mask wearing sentiment in the United States that she attaches to a declining trust in institutions. And David, both of you have mentioned a trust in government. And she wonders if the complexity of the technical issues makes it hard for people to extend their trust into vast unknown bureaucracies. And she's especially wondering whether that mistrust of institutions and of science would be in other cultures as well, and whether in China, I suppose, or elsewhere, we would see this anti-scientific sort of distrust of scientific institutions that seem to raise its head here in the United States. Do we see that in China and elsewhere also?
Jessica, do you want to take that for
Well, I mean, I can start. I have some not super well-formed thoughts on this, although I do know that my co-author is also working with one of your colleagues, Rick and Eric, Mike Neblo, comparing some of this kind of the crisis of technocracy, if you will, where there is this common challenge that many, very complex forms of government face, which is the growing distance from sort of the average person's understanding, but that, perhaps, the pandemic could illuminate, the direct, real importance of science and this expertise to their lives. And so that, perhaps unlike climate change, although I don't know, wildfires seem very proximate, and hurricanes as well, but that perhaps this is a moment at which you have I don't know how exactly this works, because you have on the one hand elites who continue to, again, whether it's the big lie or the small lie or the many lies, there's still a lot of that that discourse that I think is not grounded in fact, being pushed and perpetuated by political elites in the United States. So that'll probably persist, but nonetheless, it may be a moment at which optimistically, a broader swath of the public, at least in this country, might decide that it's time for a bit more science.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's too soon to tell whether we are in an anti-scientific interlude versus a longer term trend with respect to specific parts of the population. And I just say that this is not something that's specific to COVID by any way, shape, or fashion. If you look at the UK, the anti-scientism was part of the Brexit debate, where the economists had said this is going to be bad because we're not going to have the same trade links. And that wasn't a particularly complicated thing, or I shouldn't have been. But then you had people like Michael Gove, one of the pro-Brexit campaigners, who's literally said, I'm tired of listening to experts. And that became a sort of rallying cry, like, yeah, why do we need the experts? And what I'd like to hope is that this was just a brief interlude where various people in the US and the UK, perhaps inspired by each other's examples, decided to use this anti-expert language as a way of mobilizing people. And that after, exactly as Jessica is saying, after the pandemic, perhaps there will be a reversion to, trusting science again. But it's possible that that's not the case, and we've done more longer-term damage.
Jessica, can I just follow up and ask specifically about China, since I know you study it closely? At one time we used to call it scientific socialism, or that's actually what the Communist parties called it, scientific socialism. They kind of tried to ride on science. And then, of course, under that banner, they flew a lot of policies that didn't have a whole lot of scientific basis to them. Both in the Soviet Union and in China. And I'm wondering now whether in Chinese discussions with their people, propaganda, I guess, or public relations, what is the status of science? Do they articulate it as a highest order of policy guidance, or do they question it somewhat like what's been happening in the United States lately?
I think that science is accorded a much higher level of respect in China, and not just science, but technology. And perhaps, maybe too much so. So you do not have the same kinds of, attacks, although you do have, I think, as, Caroline pointed out earlier, efforts to sort of circumscribe what can be investigated, lest it reveal uncomfortable political truths that then might strengthen the case of outside critics of the CCP. So, it's at the kind of rhetorical, kind of ideological level, I think there is an appreciation of science, but in terms of creating the processes needed to let science speak, if you will, there is where the political kind of imperatives of the CCP's survival as a one-party state frequently come into conflict with that.
We have another question that refers to the your comments, both of your comments about how leaders here in the United States and China have tried to mobilize almost a wartime level of mobilization against COVID. And the question is that, do you think that the securitization and subsequent wartime style mobilization would be more effective if the public accepted claims of foreign responsibility and intentionality, akin to the Chinese disease framing some tried? And now the questioner says this question, of course, sets aside moral judgment of the falsity of the claim and its racist effects, but wondering whether framing this as a warlike attack from outside would be more successful or less successful in mobilizing support in democracies or in authoritarian regimes. And I guess also asking, would you support this kind of framing, or would you put it aside because of the falsity of it?
So I'll say that I think it was tried and I think it failed for these reasons. It was framed as coming from China. It was declared the Chinese virus, and a travel ban was instated, but as David pointed out, many of the cases came via Europe. And so the actual policies that resulted from this framing weren't particularly effective. And there was, I think we can debate whether this wartime footing was ever really embraced by the Trump administration, and what it will be able to mobilize under the Biden administration, who has similarly invoked the Defense Production Act and has also declared this sort of a war as well. So it seems to me that the disease or the virus is inside now, and it isn't borne by foreign vectors any longer. And so I think that it has, as you note, there are a lot of real problems with particularly the costs for society and marginalized groups of this foreign framing at this point. And so unfortunately, I don't think that any sort of, although it's really important to understand how this outbreak occurred, the political obstacles to finding out that information remain formidable and may even be ultimately counterproductive in eliciting more obstructionism from the other side.
And certainly very counterproductive for the international order, even if the logic was ineffective, it had been ramped up and trumpeted more, then that's really quite a dangerous sentiment. I mean, I think the underlying premises that external threats can mobilize people more than internal threats is a very logical one, but then we typically don't welcome external threats or hope to emphasize them when they're not really there, because they create immense amounts of conflict that can be very destabilizing.
I have a question, or something I'd like you to respond to, both of you. David, you mentioned about control of information as an advantage of authoritarian regimes, but of course the abundance of information in a democracy makes it hard to ignore. So there's sort of two sides of the same sword there. But I think maybe mass politics requires a lot of public discussion of these kinds of things. And that's common across modern regimes of both types. And my friend, Philip Tetlock, wrote a piece in the American Economic Review not too long ago, where he argued that today it's nearly impossible in the United States and in many other places to have a conversation about what he calls tragic trade-offs, which are nearly all the real trade-offs we face. And COVID's a real good example of this. We face a real tough trade-off between saving lives and then loss of lives to the economy. And there's a lot of different values that have to be discussed. And he argues that what happens in this AE article is that in modern mass politics, these things are translated by political entrepreneurs in what he calls taboo trade-offs, where the difficult wrestling with the real trade-off is transformed into, totally good versus evil. So if you're going to kill your grandmother to save $10 or some other kind of exaggeration of a completely morally unacceptable choice. And he says that because now in mass politics, we tend to see, or politicians tend to reframe them, not as tragic trade-offs that really require hard choice, but as taboo trade-offs, which are easy to decide. We are in an era of what he calls mutual assured moral destruction. And I'm wondering if any of you had ideas about how we can improve the room in democracies and I guess authoritarian states as well, for serious discussion of the tragic trade-offs that we actually face, because people don't like to face trade-offs very much. And maybe that's one of the reasons the president shirked the responsibility to state governors and let them make the heavy lift, and so on and so forth. But I guess I've said enough. I'm just curious whether you think there are things that you could recommend for either political system. David, why don't you start?
Yeah, well, I think that if you talk about that argument by Tetlock in light of COVID, then you can very, very quickly see the connection with masks, and that on one side, mask wearing was being said as something we can do and need to do, in part in order to keep as much of the economy open as we can, whereas on the other side, mask wearing was seen as something that would help destroy the economy. So it's right that the arguments were not presented in terms of we're different sometimes, but generally not presented in terms of trade-offs. I guess the question I would have is, when was it really different in mass politics? 50, 60 years ago, were politicians really willing to talk in terms of trade-offs in a way they're not today? Or are we sort of imagining a bygone era that never really existed? And so I haven't read the Tetlock article, but I'll certainly do that as soon as this session is over, because that's the question I'd like to know. And that one of the things is, it may come down not to as much the strategies and the trade-offs offered by political elites, but to underlying the extent to which the population in certain countries like the United States is willing to assume a degree of individual responsibility for, the protection of others with this pandemic.
Thanks, Rick, for that really fascinating question. And I look forward to reading that piece as well. I think that these trade-offs are ones that government leaders certainly face, and the fact that they, at least in the United States, have never or recently not been very good at, or have in fact chosen to amplify the kind of the extremes in our political discourse, I think has made it very difficult to have conversations about these trade-offs. I think looking at the way that the Chinese government has done it, because they have in fact over this time period shifted in their emphasis, making these difficult trade-offs, even at the cost of international criticism, particularly the quarantine in Wuhan, triggered a whole lot of like, how could they possibly do this? And, it's brutal, et cetera. I mean, it was, but it also saved a lot of lives domestically in China. They do so by mixing. I mean, they do so without, ceding any of these they don't let the grandmother die, and they don't say that the economy will never come back. It's actually, I think, more about the sequencing and the mixing of the objectives, in some ways trying to appear all things to everybody. And so, I mean, I think you can see a little bit of that in the way that the Biden administration has moved forward too, and trying to appeal to a wider swath of the public rather than pitching this is divisive. This should be uniting. So it's partly the rhetoric, but obviously that rhetoric doesn't always succeed and may fall on deaf ears in many cases. So, but really, really interesting, and I look forward to thinking about that more.
Well, I think we're just very close to 2 o'clock. I want to let David or Jessica, if you have any last thoughts that you wanted to make, not stimulated by a question, just something you wanted to say before we end, but it's 1:59, so we're in the last minute here.
No, I think it's been a really great discussion. I want to thank everybody. Thank Jessica as well, and just I hope the conversation continues, and that you have a session next week that's useful on federalism.
Likewise, this has been terrific, and really enjoyed the opportunity to be in conversation with David, Rick, and all of you. Thanks for attending.
I want to thank everyone. I just thought we have another question, but it's just another thank you. A great conversation from the audience. So I want to thank both of you and thank the Center for Ethics and Human Values here at Ohio State for organizing this, and it's been a pleasure to moderate it. I know there's, as Eric McGilvery mentioned at the top of this hour, or last hour, the next event is on federalism, so I invite all of you to tune in for that next week. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you all.